Hello. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming out on a kind of a nasty afternoon like this. Welcome to the first program that we are having, the Sudbury Historical Society, which we're very excited about. As you, I think, all know, the 375th anniversary of Sudbury's incorporation will be taking place next year, but we kind of think of this as the beginning of it, because our programs are going to be introducing various really important people and events that happen in Sudbury's history all through the year. And so with Israel Loring being the very first one, and Jane Graham, we'll tell you all about him. But there are just a couple of announcements that I'd like to make. First of all, we're having a tag sale, which you hopefully know about. And if you have, it's on October 19th, which is a day when there are lots of things going on here at Town Center. At First Parish, here the Arts Council will be having lots of artwork here, and we will be on the lawn right in front of Town Hall selling various items. If you'd like to contribute something, we would be delighted to receive it. If it's something that you need to have picked up, please see Ursula Lyons, who right there. Stand up, Ursula. And she can make she can make arrangements. She can make arrangements to have it picked up. Otherwise, they can be dropped off here if you just let us know, and their telephone numbers here, we'll let you know how to do that. And then, don't forget to come out and have a look at all the things that we have for sale. I also want to encourage those of you who are not members of the Sudbury Historical Society to join the Sudbury Historical Society, and we can make that happen very easily because we have a table at the back, and you can do it. It's really important right now at this time in our history because we are, in fact, within the next couple of years going to be losing the space that we now occupy on the second floor of Town Hall. And we are, at the moment, really very hopeful that we'll be able to move into the Loring Parsonage, which is very interesting that we'll be talking about Israel Loring today. And we're going to need a lot of money, actually, to restore it. We'll be going to foundations and various things like that to receive, to hopefully get money for this. But in the meantime, just having the support of the community, and the best way you can show that is by being a member of the society, really helps in our effort to be able to get funding. So it really matters. So anyway, I feel like a WGBH commercial right now. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Jane Graham.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you all for coming out on this day. I think this works. Yeah, I don't need this one. Well, so be it. Well, thank you, everybody. It's nice to see you. And you know that for most of us living here, we're so aware of the revolution and our revolutionary cemetery and the people that fought in it and our march to Concord every April 19th and stuff. And we tend to forget how much was going on for the century before that happened. And so, and not just in Sudbury, but the whole colony. There's enormous changes that I find absolutely fascinating. So we wanted to talk about Reverend Loring because he was in some ways pretty typical of the preachers of that time. And I wanted to put him in historical perspective because I think that really tells us, you know, we learned so much mythology, didn't we, when we were little, that the pilgrims came here for religious freedom and all this stuff. Fact of the matter is, most everything was economic. They wouldn't have gotten here unless somebody had a boat, you know, and the guy that had the boat was a merchant. Those were a bunch of merchants that wanted to have a settlement here so that they could make money. And so they sponsored the Pilgrims. And then they sponsored a bunch of other people coming over after that. And remember that in England at the time, there were a lot of wars in Europe, of course, but the land was held by the nobility. Society was very stratified. And almost nobody owned land. They were serfs. So coming here was really a neat deal because you could get a piece of land of your very own. And that was something. They also, one of the big motivators to come here were the plagues and things that, aside from war, of course, which is a big one, were the plagues. I mean, there were these epidemics that would wipe out families, or some people would survive, but their families were gone, and so they'd pick up stakes and come over here. And anyway, I think to understand Israel Loring, I think we need to really look at where he came from. And luckily, he kept diaries. My, did he keep diaries. He recorded everything, practically his bodily functions, but not quite. Although, actually, there were some. If anybody wants to read them, that wasn't terribly interesting. His story really starts before he was born. His grandfather was Thomas Loring, who lived in Axminster, which is in Devonshire, England. Israel's father was John, and he was Thomas's second son and was born on December 22nd, 1630. The Lorings came to this colony in 1634, so Israel's dad was 4 years old when he got here. And this was the time of the Great Awakening. I'm forgetting about this. There we go. I can't do two things. Can't talk and chew gum, you know. Okay, and I wanted. This is the Great Awakening, and this is a ship that. Okay, John Winthrop in 1630 wrote his famous sermon "City upon the Hill," while leading the first group of Puritan pilgrims here. They came on this ship, the Arabella. What?
You want me to click it?
Okay. You want to look at the numbers? No. What? What are you doing?
Just keep going.
This is my tech support, a.k.a. my daughter. Okay, the gist of the sermon echoed Christ's Sermon on the Mount, focusing on mercy, kindness, sharing, and other selfless qualities. This was quite at odds with the mainline Puritan beliefs, which derived from Calvin's doctrine of predestination. There he is. There's John Winthrop. Isn't he cute? No wonder he looks stern. If you had to wear that collar, you would too. Okay, you can go to the next guy there. Yeah, and go even to the next one if you want. Yeah, see, I have some pictures of his arrival, and that's the ships that came here. You know, at any rate, Calvin's beliefs really were that man, he had predestination. I'll get it. Predestination was what his doctrine, which meant that it was all decided before you got born. So you just had to mind your P's and Q's. And they did that because, I mean, they stuck to that because it was a lot easier to do what they're told than to have to make big decisions. They're so busy trying to survive that they let the people like this guy, I'll get to him in a minute, tell them what was what. They studied, the clergy people. Now, most Puritans followed Calvin's doctrine of predestination because it was easier than having to be responsible for one's own salvation. And it was this Calvinist form of Puritanism that the Lorings espoused. Another form was Arminianism, named for founder Jacobus Arminius, this guy, a Dutch theologian who said that the will of man is free. This limited this theory limited Calvin's belief in determinism. So, of course, there are going to be people that are going to say, no, you're wrong, and you're not. I don't know anybody would do that these days, but trust me, they did. And so, and you've probably all heard of Jonathan Edwards. He was a major theologian in the colonies, and he said that one should preach like an Arminian and pray like a Calvinist. So what that meant was it was nice to have the notion of free will, but just in case you were wrong, you got to stay prayed up at all times. And the reason I mention this is that Puritanism was many-faceted, and preachers got hired and fired on a regular basis, as we will see. Next, I think. There's just a regular preacher. I did this picture because this may be kind of what Loring looked like. We don't have any pictures of him. But, even just the tightness of their clothes makes me think they probably had tight minds as well. I don't know. Okay, to get back to our story, John, Israel's father, seems to have been a pretty pure Calvinist Puritan. He feared the Lord from his youth and feared him greatly. When not engaged in work, he spent his time reading God's word. He spent much time in prayer, heavenly meditations, and self-examination. Sounds really fun, huh? He married Israel's mother, Rachel Wheatley, who was born in Braintree in northern England. He was her second husband, as her first, Mr. Buckland of Rehoboth, was killed by Indians. Israel was born in April 1682, the third son of John and Rachel, and he was born in Hull. Let me quote from his diary. I came into this world guilty of Adam's first transgressions, which include infidelity, pride, ingratitude, visible contempt of God's majesty, born into the world wholly polluted and defiled. Really? Really? He was what, 6 pounds, 7 pounds? Oof. As if that weren't enough, he goes on to say he suffered not only from utter deficiency of all good, but a loathing and disliking of it. Not only a liableness to evil, but an inherent propension and a strong desire to it. Wow. How can, when you think about that, what a load for a little kid to carry. It sounds like he was born into the clutches of Satan, and his mission was to constantly fight this superior force. Could we go to the next one, please? Go back to that. I like that picture. Because Puritan children were expected to be little adults, and these guys don't look terribly happy. His early life was shadowed by the belief that childhood is a time of vanity. He quotes Ecclesiastes, which tends to be full of doom. The theme of the first chapter is that basically life is useless. In his diary, Loring describes himself as wild, excessively given to sport and play, proud and passionate. Fortunately, he was restrained from falling into any gross, scandalous sins. Quote, when I was about 10 years old, 1692, I awoke from my carnal security and began to pray. Really? Carnal security? 10 years old? I mean, I made me want to cry that these little guys were not allowed to play or to be happy. Anyway, Israel's parents were careful with his education. He was sent to several schoolmistresses in town to learn to read. And after that, he was sent to Reverend Whitman, the minister of the town, to learn to write. I found that interesting, that the women could teach them to read but not to write. What's with that? When he was 12, he fell out of a tree and injured both wrists. And so he couldn't proceed with his writing. So his father bought him a grammar. And that was considered much too liberal, because the only book you could read was the Bible. A grammar was just out of the question. But when he was at school, at Mr. Whitman's, preparing for college, he describes himself as being diligent, though often discouraged. You can go on. I think we, okay. Yeah. Now, while he was studying with Mr. Whitman, preparing for college, he was about 12. His father cut his foot, a serious injury to his foot. And Mrs. Whitman took care of it, but it didn't work. So then he went to Boston to Dr. Cutler. I don't know if that's any relation to anybody here, but for relief. And there was none. Dr. Cutler could not help him. And he pined away to skin and bones and was on the brink of death. And if he had died, his death would have put an end to Israel's study for the ministry. So I think it's really important to realize how fragile any of life's choices were then as well as now. Evidently, God had other ideas. Mrs. Whittemore of Medford, a doctress, don't you love that, a doctress, and kinsman of Mrs. Loring was sent for. Now, Mr. Loring didn't want to offend Dr. Cutler because he was his patient, but after Mrs. Whittemore looked at the foot and described what she thought she could do for him, he agreed, and so she took off all the dead leaves or whatever stuff was on it, and she put her own poultices on, and sure enough, she was able to help him relieve the pain and thereby sleep, and after a while, under God, effected a cure. Now, the whole summer that this was going on, Israel was taken off his studies and employed in husbandry affairs. Yeah, those are some of the tools. He was kept from the path of husbandry by both the counsel of his brother John about the concerns of his soul and the gradual recovery of his father. And so he returned to his studies. Now, I want to bookmark this place because I'm going to come back to it later when we talk a little bit about slaves, which he had. But in June of 1698, at age 16, he was admitted to the college. And when I was describing this to somebody who said, well, shouldn't you mention which college? And I said, think about it. There was only one, and we have some pictures of that one at the time. And according to him, in my freshman year, I fell from good beginnings and grew dull and lifeless in the way of religion. However, God kept hold of me. In his sophomore year, he fell into deep melancholy, which affected his physical as well as his emotional health. Boils broke out all over his skin, which did not make the 4 years of college very pleasant. So, I mean, he wasn't, one of the great scholars of the time. He was just plodding his way through college. At which do we know what number slide this is?
I didn't do it right, so no.
Can we go to the next one then?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the college. Next one. I like that picture. But this is later, because if you notice in the picture, those people look like they're in the 18th century, just from the clothes. So that's a little later, I think. Our next one. This is more like it was when he went there. Okay. There we go. In 1701, at age 18, he was admitted to the church in Hull. To be admitted was a big deal. You had to pass some sort of tests to be admitted to the church. It wasn't like, gee, this looks like a good place to worship, I think I'll join. You had to apply, and you had to be vetted by the committee and, the elders and all that stuff, and finally pass. So he was admitted. He admits to being buffeted about by the temptations of Satan, but persevered and went back to college. Isn't that nice? In July of 1701, he took his first degree, which was given to him by Dr. Increase Mather, who was president of the college for the whole time that Loring was there. Now, usually when, I think we need to go to the next, yeah, there. Usually when a man received his degree, he would take a job teaching where he was needed. And as it happened, there was a Reverend Mr. Cotton of East Hampton, and although he was a stranger to the Lorings, he persuaded Mr. Loring to keep Israel at the college. So he had the advantage of advancing his learning and preparing himself for the ministry. During this time, he became very ill with a fever and almost died. In August 1703, at 22 years old, and 2 years after receiving his first degree, Israel Loring preached his first sermon at Scituate Lower Parish. In 1704, he got his second degree, and he stayed at the college until September of that year. Okay, yes, here we go. Then his travels began. First, he went to Barnstable and then to Yarmouth. And it's interesting to read of his struggle to get there. He was invited to preach in Barnstable because the preacher was away in Connecticut. Yeah, that's the one I want. I meant to get my stick. Oh, here it is. My pointer. I brought it, but I forgot to put where it is. Yeah. Anyway, I find this really amazing, how difficult it was. He boarded a vessel in Boston to make a trip. He was going to Yarmouth, right? And but he was stopped by the weather at the castle, which I think probably was Castle Island. Yeah, thank you. By weather, and forced to go back. He took another vessel, which he thought was going to Hull, but it wasn't, and they wouldn't put him off there. So he asked them to put him off at George's Island. Did you know George's Island was named for John George, who was the first guy that decided we should have a lighthouse in Boston Harbor? Just one of those little tidbits. They were reluctant as they didn't know how he'd get off the island, but they did put him off on George's Island. And as it happened, a small skiff from Boston, bound for Hull, was going by, and he was able to get a ride to Hull. Arrived there a little before sunrise. A little after dawn, he set out for Barnstable from Hull. And a little beyond Hingham, I think we need the next one because it's a map, right? Yeah. A little beyond Hingham, he got lost in the Great Cedar Swamp and spent all morning riding back and forth. And he got no further than Duxbury that day. See, here, I'm pointing here. You can't see the
Pointer.
Yeah, but I have to point over here. There's Duxbury. He came from Hull through here, got down in here. This is where the swamp was that he got lost in and wandered back and forth. Got as far as Duxbury that day. Then he went to Plymouth and preached that next Sunday. Didn't they have a preacher? I mean, I don't get that. He was supposed to be going to Barnstable, which is down here, but he got this far. He said, okay, I'll preach here. It's a hell of a way to run a railroad, as they say. My father used to say. So anyway, he preached there. He finally got to Barnstable on the following Friday. He preached there on the Sabbath. And then he preached a lecture in Falmouth. Oh, back there. He was in Barnstable, in Falmouth. Okay. And then he went back to Barnstable for 4 more Sundays. That gives you an idea of the life of an itinerant preacher. I mean, it wasn't easy. I guess he had a good horse. I don't know. All right, now let's take a break in our story of Reverend Loring to take a look at what was going on in Sudbury, because by the end of the 1630s, the influx of Puritan English created crowding in the coastal towns, so there was pressure to move inland. Again, remember that it was during this time where there was wars going on, and there was famine. And since the people didn't own their land, more and more of what they were producing was taken away from them, and there was a lot of starvation. So there was a great impetus to get out of Dodge, come here. So we had a huge influx of immigration. Now, in 1637, one such group in Watertown petitioned the colonial legislature for the right to settle a new town directly west. They were aware of fertile lands along a river known as the Musketaquid, which we know as the Sudbury River. We have the next picture. Isn't that pretty? Lovely land. So they thought that'd be a good place to settle. I think so too. Next. Yeah, let's look at it. It's gorgeous. So 4 citizens were sent to lay out a plantation suitable for 50 or 60 families. Some, such as Cakebread, Curtis, Grout, and Stone, had lived in Watertown, but most of them came directly from England in the summer of 1638. Among them were Haynes, Noyes, Bent, and the Goodnow families. Okay. The first pastor of this new town was Edmund Brown, who, with others, came from a town in Suffolk, England, named Sudbury. So they brought the name with them. That's why we see it on the sign all the time. They named it Sudbury. And those people from Wayland, we have to remind them that when they're celebrating their 375th birthday, they're celebrating Sudbury's 375th. Because Wayland didn't get named Wayland till some years later. So now Brown, the first minister here, was part of the upper class in England. He went to Cambridge University, he played the violin or the viola, and he was very well off, much more so than most of the colonists that he found here. And he probably the reason he came here was he was very active in a nonconformist movement in England, and probably saw the handwriting on the wall and thought he'd better get out of there before he got into trouble. But he had been in one parish in England for 14 years, and he was selected as the first minister for the Sudbury Church, which was Calvinistic in faith and congregational in government. And unlike England, there was no church hierarchy, and the minister was on salary set by the town. In the beginning, the town land was held and worked in common in order to meet its expenses. In those days, that society was so stratified, those from the upper classes or close thereto were granted more land. And most of the immigrants seem to have been yeoman farmers or tradesmen, such as blacksmiths, millers, and other such. For a town to grow, a sawmill was necessary, as was a grist mill. And one of the first buildings was a meeting house that served both as a place of worship and as a place of town business. According to records, Reverend Brown's job was to see to the spiritual needs of the town, and unlike some other colonial churches, he seems to have little influence on the business of the town. There was no record of him voting, for instance, and he did try to Christianize the Indians with John Eliot, but otherwise lived the life of a country gentleman. That is, until he opposed the construction of a larger meeting house. And he did this because the land for this larger meeting house would be taken out of the land earmarked for the minister. This is when he started discussing politics from the pulpit and started throwing his power around. He was the largest landowner in the town, as it happens. He died in 1678. He was minister for life and the wealthiest man in Sudbury. After Brown, the town hired James Sherman. This turned out to be a mistake, as he had a drinking problem among others. Among the others was consorting with the undesirables. So he was fired in May of 1705 for scandalous behavior inconsistent with the gospel ministry. Okay, so the next one is Israel Loring. He's going to look really pretty good after these two guys, right? Now, back to him. We left him as an itinerant preacher serving communities on the South Shore and Cape Cod. It seems that he went to Boston to see a Mr. Barnard, and when he found Mr. Barnard had gone to Yarmouth, he continued on to Cambridge to see Mr. Brattle. That's a familiar name. While there, a Matthew Stone from Sudbury came to Cambridge to ask Mr. Brattle where he might get a minister to preach on the next Lord's Day. So Loring went to Sudbury and preached on July 29th, 1705. The next Sabbath, Loring preached in Charlestown, the following one in Hull, and the following 3 in Groton. Then he was invited back to Sudbury to preach again as for a further trial, try him out. September 16th, 1705 was the first Sabbath after he came to stay. He was 24. He was voted in at Deacon Noyes' home, and on November 20th, 1706, he was ordained pastor of the church in Sudbury. So after the worldly Edmund Brown and the profligate Mr. Sherman, it's easy to see why stern Calvinistic Mr. Loring was a logical choice. He was extremely serious about the dangers of evil. He recounts a time when he went, if you ever want to read his diaries, it's so depressing. That's all I can say. Terribly depressing. But here's one of the things he said in his diaries. It just gives you an idea. It's amazing. He recounts a time when he went to Cambridge and met with some of his classmates and friends from college. He said that he indulged in unsuitable discourse by which he perceived his heart to grow light, vain, and filthy. Poor soul. Imagine a life without laughter. He couldn't even let himself have some time off and go meet with his college buddies. I think it's tragic. Anyway, Loring lived with Mr. Wright for 3 years because he was single. On May 25th, 1709, Israel married Mrs. Mary Hayman. On June 18th, 1709, he moved into his own house on the east side of the river, and on June 22nd, his wife came from Cambridge. I went, with that one. If they were married, I guess if you didn't have a house to live in, then she's going home to mom and dad. I don't know. Okay, we also know about the controversy of the east side versus the west side of the river, don't we, ladies and gentlemen? Next. I think we have that, yeah. The town was expanding, and the old granting of lands according to one's social status was receiving opposition from many second-generation inhabitants, which stands to reason. We just didn't have the hierarchy here. The yearly flooding of the river in spring meant that many could not get across to attend church. A group from the west side, spearheaded by David Haynes, and his house is up on the corner of Morse Road and Marlborough. It's a yellow house. That's the David Haynes house, if anybody is interested. He proposed a west meeting house, while another group, including Ephraim Curtis, opposed such a proposal as they had no intention of supporting two meeting houses. Finally, in 1772, the townspeople voted to build a meeting house on the Rocky Plain, which is this. Everybody knows this. We are on the Rocky Plain, this area, and it's called the Rocky Plain because if you walk around, you'll see rocks sticking out of the huge boulders, and so it would not have been good for farming, so you might as well use it for something else. As it happened, the town refused to raise funds for the meeting house here, which led to a petition to the general court to create a separate precinct. Ultimately, Sudbury became separate from East Sudbury in 1722. Israel Loring became minister of the church in the West Precinct after serving 16 years for the whole town. He remained in this position until his death in 1772. I think most of us, when we think of him, because his house is here, think that he was ours here, and we don't even think about the other side of the river, but he actually served there longer than he did here. Reverend Loring took his position of defender of the faith very seriously. Being convinced of the inherent evil of man, he taught his flock to be vigilant in their war against Satan. One must work hard, and when not working, the only acceptable activity was praying. Only by so doing could one have any hope of escaping Satan's clutches. Any adverse events, be it illness, war, poor crops, was seen as the work of Satan and a manifestation of man's evil nature. And incredible as it may seem, such a belief is alive and well today in certain fundamentalist sects of Christianity. And this, everybody knows that this is this house, because is there anybody here who hasn't been in his house? Because it's right there on the other side of this building. And there's a side entrance from the exit road from the parking lot. As you go out of this parking lot, you'll go right by the house. It's a pretty nifty house, and we would love to get hold of it for the society because it makes sense. I mean, we should have it. So let's make it happen, right? We couldn't talk about the Lorings or indeed anyone of the period without discussing slavery. And as you know, almost all households relied on slave labor for cooking, cleaning, and field work. And the Lorings were no exception. The Lorings, the most well-known of these was Simeon. He was born to Hannah, who was a house servant of the Lorings. And records indicate that Hannah was a slave, but then later was hired. Israel freed his slaves, and had none when he died. And Hannah was a hired servant for many years in the home. So perhaps she had been a slave and then was released, or, yeah, but that's probably the case. Now, Simeon was born in the home and freed when he was 21 years of age. He fell ill and died at age 22. Can we have his picture there? There. That is his gravestone. He is buried right out here in the Revolutionary War Cemetery, if anybody wants to see where he is. The Lorings are not. We don't know where. It's interesting, of the guys for whom the schools here in Sudbury named, I don't know if any are buried. Only one is buried in town that we know of, and that is Deacon Haynes, who's buried in the Revolutionary War Cemetery, for whom Haynes School is named. But the others, we don't know where they are. Now, slavery wasn't limited to people of African descent. There are 3 Scottish slaves buried in Wayland, and in researching for this presentation, I found that white slavery was a large part of our regional and national history. Many people aren't as familiar with this aspect of slavery, so I thought I'd share some of the findings with you. So far, so good. Any questions so far on Mr. Loring? Yes.
Tell us what the gravestone says.
Yes.
Yes.
What does it say?
What does it say?
It
Do you
says,
remember?
here lies the body.
What does the gravestone say?
Here lies the body.
Here, speak into here, please.
Oh, it says, here lies ye body of Simeon, the once dutiful and beloved servant of the preacher Israel Loring, who died May 1755, at 22 years of age, something like that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's always good to have young eyes do these things. Yes, it's interesting. We have such weird the things about slavery, that there was such a long-held belief that slaves were better off, that they were being taken care of because they were childlike and stuff like that, especially the Africans. What nonsense was that? I mean, really. Anyway, we think of slaves, we mainly think of Africans because we can see them, they stand out. However, white slaves, specifically Irish, were prevalent. And I notice when I say this, people say, oh, you mean indentured servants, you know, as if this is a more acceptable form of servitude. No, I mean slaves. Following the customs of the ancient world, the Europeans had been selling their captured enemies into slavery for millennia, and the English were no exception. They'd been selling the Irish since the reign of Elizabeth I. Many went into voluntary exile, many were killed, but there were just too many of them, so James I encouraged the sale of Irish as slaves to the New World colonies, not just in America, but to Barbados and South America. The first record of such is in 1612. A group of Irish slaves were sold to a settlement along the Amazon. In 1625, the king issued a proclamation that all Irish political prisoners be transported to the West Indies and sold to the planters there. In 1637, 69% of the population in Montserrat and the West Indies were Irish slaves. The Irish had a tendency to die in the heat and were not as well suited to the work as Africans. But Africans had to be bought, and the Irish did not. They could be kidnapped And if they would send prisoners, but if there weren't enough, they just kidnap a bunch of them. And this made the Irish the preferred livestock for English slave traders for 200 years. Then came the time of Cromwell, when even more Irish were killed or sold into slavery. From 1651 to 1660, there were more Irish slaves in America than the entire non-slave population of the colonies. Let me repeat that. From 1651 to 1660, there were more Irish slaves in America than the entire non-slave population of the colonies. For all of the 17th century, there were more Irish slaves in the colonies than Africans. Africans cost more, so they were treated better. Also, the Irish were harder to distinguish from their owners, so they were branded with the owner's initials. The women were branded on the forearm. Sound familiar? Do you remember another group that was branded? And the men on their buttocks. Often Irish women were bred with African men because lighter-skinned Africans were worth more money. In 1681, a law was passed against breeding Irish women and African men, not because it was morally wrong, but because the Royal African Company was losing money. There is still a population of black Irish in the West Indies. Now, I always thought black Irish referred to Spanish Armada that, crashed on the shores of Ireland and interbred with the Irish, but evidently not. It refers to the Irish that were bred with these black people in the West Indies. One more little tidbit about slavery. In 1688, the first woman killed in Cotton Mather's witch trials in Massachusetts was an old Irish woman named Anne Glover, who had been captured and sold into slavery in 1650. She spoke no English. She could recite the Lord's Prayer in Gaelic and Latin, but not English. Mather decided that her Gaelic was a discourse with the devil and had her hanged. Pictures are hung, people are hanged. Weird language. It was not until 1839 that a law was passed ending the slave trade. But I digress. We're here to talk about Israel Loring. What is interesting about his relationship to slavery was that he had slaves and he freed them. There is no evidence that he had them growing up. And that's why, remember I said to bookmark the thing back early on when I talked about him having to drop out of school when his father had that grave injury. The fact that he would have had to drop out of school had his father not recovered from his foot injury when Israel was 12 suggests that there were no slaves in the Loring family. Perhaps he married into a slave-holding family. That happened. And the whole subject of colonial slavery is a minefield, too much for us to consider today. Just to give you an idea, George Washington, a respected Virginia planter that you may have heard of, had lots of slaves as he had lots of property. He did not believe in breaking up families. He married Martha Dandridge Custis, who came with an estate in trust from her late husband. Much of that estate was slaves. Washington freed his slaves upon his own death, but he could not free the dower slaves. And many of the dower slaves were married to the freed ones. So you can see it's a mess. Free but not able to leave unless they abandon their families. So you can see that this is a really complex subject that probably we should best leave for another day. So that's what I have to say about Mr. Loring and about slavery. Do we have any questions? Oh, I also, because people are going to say, how do you know? So I have a resource, if anybody wants to take this bibliography. This is just for the white slave things. I don't have very many because I don't think most people would want it. I didn't want to waste paper, but if we run out, I'll get you one. Okay, but I thought there would be some that would like to know these references as to the slave thing, and the, especially if you're Irish. Okay? So, thank you. Any questions?
This is being recorded. Please let me get to you when you have a question. Yes, Ursula.
Thank you, Jane. When we do a program in the spring with the third graders, we have Mrs. Loring and then we have the Reverend. But Mrs. Loring, was that Mary who had been a widow? And did she have children? Because she talks about her 6 or 7 children. 7. Betsy was Mrs. Loring last year.
Yes, I remember.
So I'm just curious about the family situation. Thank you.
I don't know.
She was a widow. She was a widow.
She was a widow. Mary was a widow. So it was probably the same person that I mentioned here. I had the feeling that she came from some money and brought a bunch of slaves with her. And probably if she had that many children, of course, they would need slaves. One couldn't do it all themselves, right? But I really don't know more than that. I got so depressed reading the diaries. Oh, no idea.
I could widen this a little bit. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Irish slaves were the principal population in Iceland.
Yes, yeah.
As well. So this matter of indenturing Irish people has a very long history.
Yes. And they were, what happened, a lot of times they were sold into slavery for 10 years, but that wasn't, that just because it was a 10-year limit that didn't mean they were treated humanely. They were chained and beaten and everything else. And their children would be born into lifetime slavery if they had children during that 10-year period. Their offspring were lifetime slaves. I don't know how that works, but that's what they did.
I have the family genealogy here with the Israel Loring page. And he and his wife, Mary, are listed as having 7 children together. They had John, Elizabeth, Mary, Nathan, Jonathan, and twins, Sarah and Susan.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, Jane. I have a question. Do you know why, when the town split up into East Side and West Side parishes, Israel Loring decided to come to the West Side and not stay on the East Side?
No, don't know that. I think he was offered the position. They wanted him to come. Chances are they were going to build him this lovely house for his wife and 7 children. That would have been an impetus. But beyond that, I don't know why he opted to come, especially after serving on that side so long. And it didn't last long here. Once he actually got here, there weren't that many years before he died.
Questions? Answers?
Yeah, let's have answers.
Yes, Susan.
Could you give us any information about how he was compensated by the parish? And did the position of minister come with farmland that the minister could till? Was that why he needed slaves?
Good question. Originally what happened was there was common land in the town, any town, that everybody shared the responsibility for, and then they were had to pay a portion of that to the town minister. So he didn't have to do his own farming because he was busy rescuing their souls from the clutches of Satan. That takes a lot of time, So that's what happened. And so when he came here, and especially since they built the meeting house and his house on the rocky plain, there was no farmland immediately. So they continue that situation of, they didn't have common land so much, but everybody had to pay. They had to support the minister. That's how it worked. Yes?
There is a Mather School in Dorchester, right next to the First Parish in Dorchester, which is high on Meeting House Hill. And there's a school which is still functioning, but was it named for this Cotton Mather?
Where is it?
Dorchester.
In Dorchester?
In Dorchester.
Yes, probably was. There was a whole Mather clan. There was Increase Mather and Cotton Mather and all of them. There were a whole line of colonial preachers, president of Harvard, you know. So yes, it was named for him. Yeah.
Anyone else? Mary.
Oh, it's Mary. She's always asking
You
questions.
mentioned how landowning was so rare in the olden days, you know, and I've read some time ago that even today, or, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, 85% of Scotland was owned by 350 entities.
Oh, sure.
Most of the land in the country was the great estates, and it wasn't just the country land. Some of those lords owned the land of the cities.
Yes.
You know, it was
The same in
very
England.
rare to own
Yeah,
land.
the same in England. It was very rare. And the same in France. And France was even worse because in France they hung on to the old medieval ways. In England, at least, there were some enlightened landowners who got into agriculture and learned about rotating crops and things. And so they really tried to maximize their land. And they also tried different kinds of crops, whereas in France, they relied mostly on wheat. And if they had a bad wheat year, half the population died. And they wouldn't use any modern conveniences. And if you look at some of the paintings from 1885, let's say, there's a painting, I think, by Van Gogh of people tilling the field, and Millet of that period of time too, tilling the field exactly the same way they were doing 200 years before. They just were resistant to any modern stuff, whereas in England they were all over it. That's why the Industrial Revolution started there. And so it's amazing for us because we're all landowners here. That was one of the big deals. To come here, you could own land, which is why so many people came and fought for us too. In the Revolution, you know, the British used rented troops from Germany, and they rented troops to come and fight the war. And a lot of those people just stayed because, boy, I can get some land, and I can be, you know, independent. So yes, all of the land, pretty much all of it, very, very, very little was owned by people that were not of the upper class. Yeah.
Mr. Goodnow, or is it Mr. Cutler?
Well, I have a question. Jane, you may have seen something about this. Perhaps Lee would have to comment. There's a rumor around that Reverend Israel Loring preached against fornication, shall we say, on Sundays because
sure.
it was sinful.
Yeah.
And condemned people whose children were born on Sunday because he also believed children were born on the day that they were conceived. Until one of his children was born on Sunday.
Yeah.
And Hal was there to know that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. I mean, this poor man was so beset. I mean, when you read these diaries, there's such gloom and doom, and what a terrible person. And think of how depressed he was in college. He got boils, and he was so terrified of anything that smacked of lightness in his life or anybody else's life. What surprises me is that with that kind of attitude, he stayed so long. But my sense is that at that time, people were so busy surviving because it was subsistence all the way, that they came to church and they listened and they tried to do as they were told, but they basically just went home and tilled their fields and took care of their kids. I don't think they suffered in agonies the way he did. But I mean, I like to think that. What do I know? You know.
Questions?
Do we know anything about his descendants? In other words, did they stay? They had to replace. They probably had to move when they got a new pastor. But do we know what happened?
I don't, but somebody does over there.
I think we have a descendant right here.
Have a descendant.
Um, I'm dropping the book. I have my mother's genealogy book here. My name is Debbie Stone, descended from the Stones,
Yeah.
the Haynes, the Lorings, and the Noyes,
And everybody else.
etc. And I have the book here that my mother did. It's all handwritten. Everyone has a page and a number. She has all of his children listed here. I'm descended through his daughter Mary, who married Alicia Wheeler. So they'll each have a page in the book, so we could follow through in the book to see where they went, who their children were.
Is there a copy of this book that's been given to the Historical Society?
No, there is
Why?
There is one copy. It's handwritten in pencil on notebook paper.
Well,
That my mother
digitize
did.
it, my dear.
Her mother, Louise, did an incredible job going into the land courts, the probate courts, all original research. And we would appreciate you
Yes.
coming by, and we'll make a copy.
Yeah.
Okay, Deborah?
The interesting part that I can share with you is in researching work that I was doing at the Loring Parsonage, the town owned that property when they had the house, but in his will, he assumed over the 70-some years that he lived there that it was his, and he willed it out to his children.
It became a big controversy. And it was never allowed again in New England.
Yeah,
in
squatters'
Massachusetts. Any other questions or observations? Yes, we have one. Just a minute.
Now that my cousin has broken the ice, I'm also almost a descendant of Reverend Israel Loring. The almost is because his brother John died young. John's children were divided up between the various families, and Israel got Nicholas, who he raised, and he became a minister. The only one in the family that became a minister himself. That was my ancestor. What is your name? Herb Hicks. My grandmother was Loring.
Thank you. And the journals are available online at the town's website, Historic Archives. Click on there. And the journals are, as Jane says, are extensive.
Yes. Yes. I don't want it. No. No, thank you. Thank you. Yes. I'm glad I didn't know before. I would have been intimidated.